You may have heard Voltaire's quip about the Holy Roman Empire, that it's neither holy nor Roman, nor even an empire. Well, it turns out Voltaire might as well have been speaking about modern monetary theory. It's hardly modern, it has a curious understanding of money, and it's barely even a theory. But Voltaire wasn't an economist. Hayek was. So what would Hayek say? I'm Scott Nelson with the Austrian Economic Center and Hayek Institute in Vienna, Austria. And this week, we're going to take a look at what Hayek has to say about modern monetary theory. Okay, so first things first, modern monetary theory isn't actually modern. In 1905, for example, Georg Friedrich Knapp, in his book State Theory of Money, essentially made the case already for modern monetary theory, which, I might add, the founder of the Austrian School of Economics, Karl Menger, had also refuted. And even a century prior to Knapp, one finds similar ideas in the work of the German philosopher Johann Gottlieb Fichte. Now, as for modern monetary theory's curious understanding of money and its flimsiness as a theory, well, I'll cover that and some more in this video. So let's start by asking, what is modern monetary theory, or MMT? Modern monetary theory is an idea that says that governments cannot go broke under the following conditions. Number one, they have their own central bank and issue their own currency. Number two, they have control over their own monetary policy. And number three, they don't sell debt in a foreign currency. So why is it that these conditions mean that a country cannot go broke? Well, modern monetary theory says that whenever the government needs to pay for something, it can always have the central bank print more money and buy its debt. Modern monetary theory assumes, therefore, that there is really no separation between the government and the central bank. But if the central bank prints tons of money and the government goes on a spending spree, won't that lead to massive inflation, you might ask? Well, modern monetary theory says that this will not happen if the economy is not at full capacity. So in other words, MMT says that this will not happen if there are still unemployed people. And if inflation does occur, modern monetary theory suggests raising taxes in order to remove money from the economy. Now, given many countries' staggering public debt levels, you can see why MMT is so attractive to some people. But there's more. MMT states that the traditional thinking about public expenditures and debt is mistaken. So traditionally, when we want to buy something, we ask ourselves if we have the money for it. And it doesn't matter whether you're an individual, a household, or a country. But modern monetary theory says that this is the wrong way of looking at the issue. MMT says rather that money is not the result of a barter system, as we discussed in a much earlier video on money. Instead, MMT says that money comes from the government. So if you look at your currency, it was created by some government or centralized authority. And if we, the private sector, want more money, then we actually need the public sector, the government rather, to create it. And so there's something curious about this in modern monetary theory. In MMT, therefore, government deficits are actually good. They're good because they give the private sector the money that they need to exchange. Okay, so Hayek, as you can imagine, would have had several problems with modern monetary theory. He would have opposed the implied dependency of the private sector on government, for one. And as we've already explored, he would have disagreed with MMT's theoretical definition of money. Although he probably would have agreed that nowadays, in practice, our money happens to come from the government. But you see, this is precisely the problem for Hayek, which is why he advocated denationalized money, as we also explored in a previous video. Hayek would also probably agree that in practice, the government and central banks work closely enough together that they could be considered the same. so that we can say that government prints money when in reality it's actually the central bank that's doing the printing. And this poses grave problems that extend beyond just inflation. How? Well, inflation, as it turns out, is connected to property rights. And as an individual's money is his property, when it's inflated and loses value, the individual effectively is expropriated of a portion of his property. On an historical note, it's interesting to see just how far removed from the severity of this problem we are in this day and age. After all, inflation, we can think of inflation as a form of property theft. It's a defiling of the currency, of one's property, of the very means by which we buy and sell. And so it's not for nothing that Dante Alighieri places counterfeiters, those falsifiers of money, in the final pocket, way down in the 8th circle of hell. So when Hayek calls for the denationalization of money, he's not only defending your property rights, he's trying to save your soul. Okay, so back to modern monetary theory. Now, Hayek would have had more general philosophical problems with modern monetary theory, but let's not forget that Hayek owed his initial fame to his economic work on monetary theory and business cycles. And so he was very keen on understanding how processes actually work in detail. So he would have had a problem, for example, with the way that modern monetary theory ignores the interactions between government and the private sector on the one hand, and banks and the private sector on the other hand. For example, he would have pointed out that MMT fails to differentiate between government securities and private securities. The distinction is important because when the central bank creates money, who is it buying securities from? The ECB, the European Central Bank, buys proportionately more private securities than the US Federal Reserve does. Money can therefore enter the private sector without increasing the government deficit. And Hayek would also have pointed out that governments inject money into an economy not just by having their central banks print more money, but also by borrowing from domestic and foreign lenders. And this last point reveals something else that's interesting about modern monetary theory. So remember we said that the government wouldn't go broke provided they don't sell debt in a foreign currency? Well, it may be the case as a result that modern monetary theory discourages international capitalism. And in this sense, it's highly opposed to the liberal international order. Now, for protectionists and nationalists, this could be welcome news, but it could also harm domestic consumers in the way that protectionism always does. Higher production prices would put smaller companies out of business. Greater overall unemployment would be the result. Now, in response, modern monetary theory says that the state would compensate for this with a guaranteed jobs program to return to full employment. Needless to say, the end result would be a much larger public sector. Okay, so what does this all mean then? Politicians would have a much greater role to play in designing employment programs and determining what projects to spend the endless supply of money on. Taxation could allegedly be used to fend off inflation, which is what the modern monetary advocates say, although I think Hayek would still be very wary about the inflationary potential of MMT, despite stringent fiscal policy. After all, one need only look at the 1960s when Lyndon B. Johnson raised taxes in the United States, and yet high inflation persisted until Paul Volcker raised interest rates in the early 1980s. But even if taxation could have the desired effect of lowering inflation, Hayek would probably be doubtful of the courage of politicians to raise taxes and cut back on spending when necessary. I mean, so rarely do things like that actually occur. But even if politicians were willing to raise taxes, Hayek would be worried about how politicians could use taxation as a political weapon. They could tax in order to redistribute wealth in accordance with the preferences of whoever is in government. Or they could also tax in order to go after certain groups that they wish to punish, certain industries, for example, certain individuals. So far from Hayek's desired dethronement of politics, modern monetary theory would exacerbate the political polarization we're already seeing. And the public sector would grow even larger and crowd out private investment. Hayek would observe that a scheme to ignore public deficits and ensure full employment would end up severely limiting individual freedom. He would also find the goal of full employment to be dubious. Hayek understands the economy as a dynamic system. And this means that people are being employed and unemployed with great regularity. For example, as Deirdre McCloskey observes, in the United States, every month, 1.7 million jobs vanish through creative destruction. And so these are not jobs that people are just up and quitting. These are jobs that cease to exist because employers move, or they go out of business, or they downsize because of production costs, or minimum wage, or paid vacation laws, or what have you. So Hayek would view attempts to ensure full employment not only to be impossible, but also dangerous and destructive of a free and dynamic society. Now, the consequences of modern monetary theory will differ depending on the country. So let's take Austria, for example. Because Austria doesn't control its own currency, it needs to worry about debt levels. It cannot necessarily be assured that the ECB will bail it out indefinitely. And so MMT in Austria would undermine markets and Eurozone countries' confidence in Austria and lead to much higher bond yield spreads. The only way it could restore confidence would then be either to abandon MMT or to set punitively high tax rates, wealth tax, inheritance tax, higher corporate taxes, etc., etc. The state would expand enormously in order to implement job guarantee schemes. Modern monetary theory is highly counterproductive, then, in countries that aren't large and self-sustaining enough that they can isolate themselves from the world economy. And in fact, it's questionable how capable any country is in this day and age of isolating itself from the world economy. The US is a much bigger economy than Austria, and unlike Austria, it has control over its own monetary policy. So applying modern monetary theory in the US would probably undermine the status of the dollar as the world reserve currency. One of the other curiosities of MMT is that, to the extent that it could work at all, it might only be possible in a rich and privileged country. Moreover, it actually will lead to the redistribution of wealth, but not in the way you might think. I mean, the wealth from the lower classes will be transferred to the elite. And why is this? Well, the money created by government goes first to large banks, investment banks, for example, long before it makes its way down to the average worker. The purchasing power of the working class will therefore be disproportionately less than that of the financial elite. And so once again, as we see with so many of these theories, modern monetary theory seems to be a theory concocted in the name of fairness and social justice, but which really appeals to the already privileged elites that look down on the people they claim to be helping. Modern monetary theory requires the centralization of purposes and resources that we see only during wartime. It is not by accident that such a theory should become more popular now amidst great economic uncertainty and soaring public debt. Modern monetary theory would turn a peacetime economy into a wartime economy and thereby put us all on the road to serfdom. And that's what Hayek would say. Everyone, so I hope you enjoyed this video on modern monetary theory. And it turns out, like so many of these economic theories, modern monetary theory is linked to a lot of other things. Now, one of the things we covered in this video was inflation. If that's a topic that interests you and you want to learn about some of the very deleterious effects that modern monetary theory could have on our economies, then I suggest you check out our other 2 videos on inflation. They're very important to this topic. And above all, if you enjoyed this, then please like, subscribe, and share with your friends.